This is week 12, chapter 11 on local participation. The first thing I wanted to cover was the scale of high to low city elections because that's part of the first question, and we uh, we need to understand what that means in order to answer the question. So what you have is the most participation would be at the high level in a big city election. First of all, the biggest attraction is the mayor, and then secondly, the city council. Below that would be small and medium-sized cities with a mayor form and a city council. Then below that would be any city, county, or town that has a commission form. Below that would be the courts, and then finally special districts would be at the bottom. So the first question is why local voting is lower as you go down the scale. Well, the first reason is because the media doesn't cover local elections very much. If you just look at a newspaper or TV news, you can see that the basic local governmental activity is ignored. The second thing, and maybe one goes with the other, is a lack of voter interest. Most people are interested in national politics and then to some degree state politics, and local comes third. Incumbents tend to dominate, and because they do, there's not a lot of challengers, and oftentimes that makes the campaigns pretty boring. Another thing is that there's one party politics or nonpartisan elections, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And then there's a lack of campaigning in general at the local level. There's very little, except for in big cities, of television campaigning. Most of it is like billboards and yard signs and that sort of thing. Um, a lack of issues is another reason. And finally, elections are held at odd times, oftentimes in the winter, and that's discouraging to people if they are going to get out. The second thing is what's a nonpartisan election and why do we have them? That is, definition is on the left here, no parties on the ballot, only candidates' names. And why do we have them? Well, they're a product of the reform movement. It was seen as a way to end corruption and machine politics because machine politics was all about parties and um, the domination of one party over the other. Another thing was a belief that if you got rid of the party labels and had just the candidates' names, that it would increase issue voting and get rid of party voting. And then lastly, it would attract good candidates because the argument would be that people who didn't want anything to do with machine politics would be interested if you didn't have that kind of system. So now the third question is what caused a decline in the machine? Well, there were a number of reasons. If you think about machines, and you can read about this in the book, they lasted from about 1900 to about 1950. There was some activity before that, but that's roughly about the terms of the history of it. And what you had was first generation immigrants moving to the big cities, and they were willing to exchange their vote um, for some kind of social service like helping them get a job or a house or something along those lines because they didn't speak English or they didn't have any skills. But when you get to second, third, and fourth generation immigrants, they're not interested in that kind of thing anymore. They just want good public services. Another thing is a decline in patronage. Well, patronage is a system where people are appointed to positions, and the machine lived off of this, where they were appointed to positions not because they had any skills, but because they were loyal members of the party. And they did two things. They gave money to the party, and second of all, they worked for the party during election campaigns. So the more patronage workers the machine had, the more workers they had out there and the more money they were able to supply to their candidates. So there was a change in cultural attitudes as time went on as we get past the 1950s and past the domination of this first generation immigrants. And the cultural change was that people didn't want to, they were fed up with corruption and they didn't want machine politics. They wanted good services. Another thing is the rise of social service organizations, because what happened is that the government, especially the national government and to some degree the states, started to provide the social services that the machine was providing, like helping people who were poor, getting jobs and housing and all the rest. Another thing is racial division. As blacks moved into the city, it wasn't just immigrants from European countries anymore. It was blacks from the South, and they weren't as interested in the machine as were the white people. And then finally, the last one is the rise of the merit system. And the merit system is where it's the opposite of patronage. It's where you appoint people because they can pass exams or they have qualifications rather than that they are loyal to a certain political party. More causes would be the direct primary. Once we went from caucus and convention to primaries, it weakened the parties. When you have the voters directly choosing the candidates, that weakens the party. I think I talked a little bit about that before, where in Chicago, Mayor Daley and a bunch of his cohorts made the decisions as to who would be the candidates. Another thing was the elimination of straight ticket voting. You could go in there and just make one mark on a ballot when they had straight ticket voting, and you make the mark on the top with the party, and that would vote for all the candidates of the party throughout the ballot. So you could be in the voting booth for about 5 seconds, and that would be the end of it. And we got rid of the idea of a straight ticket voting, and as a result, that weakened the parties as well, or weakened the machine, I should say. Short ballot, that also weakened the party because, again, if you have a long ballot with administrative positions on there, all the way from, like county commissioners to, or all the way down to dog catchers, with a long ballot, it helped the party because people didn't know who these candidates were, much like with court elections. People don't have any idea who the candidates are. So as a result, they'll just vote parties. So the short ballot weakened the parties, weakened the machine. At-large elections, that's where people run over the entire city rather than from wards or small districts. And that also weakened the machine. And then finally, nonpartisan elections, where you didn't have any party on the ballot. The last question is, what is reform politics and how did it impact the structure and elections at the local level? Well, the one structural change that was made was manager government. And essentially what you could say was that it resulted in, or the reform movement affected elections by developing the following things that are on the right here, which is nonpartisan elections, at-large elections, the short ballot, and the primaries. All of those things were implemented as well in terms of affecting elections. So in terms of structure of government, you had the manager form of government, and if you look in the book, you'll see that the manager is a reform movement, and there's a city mayor council form, there's the manager form, and there's the commission form. And fundamentally, the reformers were in favor of a manager government, which would be a kind of professional mayor, so to speak. And they also implemented these other things in elections, nonpartisan elections, at-large elections, short ballot, and primaries. And by doing that, they were able to influence basically the lack of turnout that we have at the local level.